Bonjour, tout le monde. Good morning, everybody. We will start the session of this morning. It's sure it will be a very interesting session as the previous one. The first speaker is our colleague Gaston Godard from the Parisian Institute of the Physics of the Globe. He will talk about the first description of the Miocene sediments of Sainte-Croix-du-Mont near Bordeaux, 1622. So, Gaston.
Thank you.
Please.
So, dear colleagues, I would like to tell you about a very old, very rare, and very strange book. It's very old because it was published in Paris in 1622, just 400 years ago. It's also very rare because it was published in 40 copies, and but today it's available on Gallica. You can upload it very easily. The author was Pierre de L'Ancre, conseiller du roi en son conseil d'État. Who was Pierre de L'Ancre? Pierre de Rostegui de l'Ancre was councillor at the Parliament of Bordeaux. You must know that before the French Revolutions, the parliaments were courts of justice that recorded the laws and dispensed justice in the name of the king. But there were several parliaments. There was one in Paris, but also another one in Aix-en-Provence, Dijon, Rouen, Rennes, Bordeaux, and so on. So the law was not uniform in the kingdom. In each parliament, justice was dispensed by councillors who were appointed, not elected. It was not a democracy. Therefore, Pierre de l'Ancre was a councillor in the Parliament of Bordeaux, was a jurisdiction extended over a large part of the southwestern France. As a member of this parliament, he was charged in 1609 with a mission to purge the Basque country in very southwestern France of sorcerers, wizards, and witches under the influence of demons. You remember probably that through the all Western Europe, between the wars of religion and the 30 Years' War, several thousands of so-called witches were killed during what is called the witch hunt. Pierre de l'Ancre participated in this movement for the Basque country. He was apparently responsible for the atrocious death of some 40 alleged witches and a few priests who were burned alive at the stake. In my opinion, this Pierre de l'Ancre was a real criminal. Today's Taliban are almost like humanists compared to him, actually. So he published this book with this title that I tried to translate here, but which is not, by the way, so easy. And this, as you can see, the incredulity and disbelief of the witchcraft plainly baffled. It's a book in which Pierre de l'Ancre intended to justify his policy of terror with regard to the so-called witches. Then, why are we interested in such a book when one deals with the history of geology? To tell the truth, I think that I am the first geologist to have read this book. Actually, it is very, very interesting because it initiates with 52 pages of advertisement dedicated to the king. The king at the time was Louis XIII. And this advertisement has nothing to do with witches. It is in some way a book within the book. While the main text evokes witches and witchcraft to the point of nausea, I can tell you that because I had to read it completely. This part here, on the contrary, is a text of written by a very cultured man with a real passion for science and geology. It is, by the way, difficult for me to understand how such intolerant criminal man was also a cultured and open-minded scientist. So this part is actually, I present you as an account of a geological field trip by the king, Louis XIII, on October the 2nd, 1620. This excursion took place at Sainte-Croix-du-Mont near Bordeaux. And by the way, I announce you that this is an excursion that those of you who are participating to the post-conference excursion will do again next Saturday, 402 years after Louis XIII. So Sainte-Croix-du-Mont is here. You have here a geological map of the Bordeaux region with the Garonne River. And Sainte-Croix-du-Mont is here. It's a very famous locality known for its very fossiliferous sedimentary terrains, which for us are Miocene. You see all these terrains here are Miocene. If Pierre de L'Ancre relates this excursion, it is because he owned the house of Lubins. Can you see the cursor here? I know it is not visible, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, so Lubins is here, and this was Pierre de L'Ancre's home. And where the king passed, the king came on October 2, 1620. And indeed, Pierre de L'Ancre was very proud of this. We too, we will be received in Lubins by the current owner, Arnaud de Sèze, during the excursion. So Sainte-Croix-du-Mont and Lubins show a level of 3-4 meters thick, made only of oysters, often with the two valves connected. You can see, for example, here the two valves in connection. This level is now attributed to the Burdigalian, so the lower Miocene. Who participated to this excursion? Indeed, the Louis XIII. He was then only 29 years old. Pierre de L'Ancre's account shows that he was actually not very interested in the origin of the oysters. In other times and other circumstances, he would have been a very bad student of geology. On the contrary, Charles d'Albert, Duc de Luynes, was then the most influential person in France. We are just before Richelieu, 3-4 years after Richelieu becomes prime minister, you remember. So this Charles d'Albert de Luynes, he debated, apparently, of the origin of the oysters, and he pronounced himself for a transport of these oysters from the ocean during the biblical flood. Gaston d'Orléans was the king's brother, But at that time, he was only 12 years old, so probably too young to have a clear opinion. But later, you see, Gaston d'Orléans will be very interested in science, and we know that he will constitute one of the best cabinets of curiosities in France. He was accompanied by his teacher, Abel Brunier, who was also a scientist. He was botanist. And indeed, there were many other people, but these people are mentioned by Pierre de L'Ancre in his report. So the route followed by this company was first, we will do the same almost, Allée des Pins, you see here. The people come to Lubins, which again was the home of Pierre de l'Ancre, and they went to a troglodyte chapel, excuse me. And this is an image quite recent, postal card of this chapel of Sainte-Croix-du-Mont, Lubins. All this part here is full of oysters. This is this famous level of oysters of 3-4 meters thick. The base of the level, you can see it here, okay? And the chapel is dug in it, and it was dug in it. It was in front of this outcrop that the king and his court wondered about the oysters and discussed their origin. After that, after the chapel, the king and his companions continued their observation along what what Pierre de l'Ancre calls Allée des Fontaines, in that part here. We will do again all this excursion ourselves during the excursion. Why Allée des Fontaines? Because there are many springs at the base of the Miocene level here. And then they reach the Garonne River. It is interesting to note that the king and his court followed the itinerary downhill from the top to the bottom, up to the Garonne. The Garonne River is there. But Pierre de l'Ancre will, after that, describe and list the sedimentary levels in the other direction as a modern geologist, from bottom to top. So in his report of this geological field trip, he first described the pierre figurée, that is to say, the fossils. He mentioned oysters, indeed, there were so many, coquillages, which mean lamelli branches, langue de serpent, glossopetræ, limaçon à plusieurs retortillons. For the francophones, it's a very strange description. These are gastropods in spiral, and so on. He debates on the origin of these oysters, particularly the oyster level. And de l'Ancre considers 3 hypotheses. L'usus naturae, it's what we call generally like this, or games of nature, if you want, which means he called it ébattement de la nature, which for francophones is also very strange because ébattement or ébat is a game with a special sexual connotation, if you want. So it's very, very strange. So according to this hypothesis, the fossils are formed in situ without an organic origin. It's a very common hypothesis at the time. Second hypothesis, the fossils, the oysters, were brought by the flood, the biblical flood from the ocean. But he considers also the possibility of a deposit by a sea, an ancient sea. He writes, but I translated it in English, that marine sediments which emerge through movement of the sea could have consolidated over lengthy ages. Lengthy ages, actually, really, he writes par de longs siècles in French. He writes also, we see the seas which are in perpetual agitation, some withdrawing, others flooding, and the shape of the innumerable sites undergoing change. So imagine mobility of the seas, which is quite modern at the time, but not unique. Peresque, for example, had such ideas, and also a few members of the Accademia dei Lincei in Italia. But at the end, he doesn't choose clearly among the three hypotheses. So he leaves the hypothesis like this, without a clear opinion about his choice. Then he described the sedimentary levels, and maybe this is the more important part of his description. During this description of the sedimentary levels, he used the names couche, in couche de pierre dure, for example, here. Couche is layer. But he also used estage, étage or stage. When I read this for the first time, I was so surprised of this word in a geological context, because this word will be used 2 centuries after to define our modern concept of geological stage by d'Orbigny, Alcide d'Orbigny. So it was used almost in the same sense of level in a pile. Okay. This name estage is actually from the old French, which evolved into étage in the modern French, but which gave also stage in English through the Norman dialect. There are many words like this. Escole in Old French gave école and school. Estrange, étrange, and strange, and so on. So, you should close your microphone, please. Thank you. That's okay. So, Monsieur Deschamps, n'oubliez pas de couper votre microphone parce que ça fait des interférences ici. Merci. So I give you here a description by Pierre de L'Ancre in French of his various étages, stage, first, second, third, and so on. And the current attributions, we are not going to see that in the detail, but I only translate you about the second stage. The second stage going uphill contains shells in the form of small twisted snails, gastropods, which Tertullian calls buccinae, which are indeed gastropods. He insists on the fact that the fossils in this stage are not the same are the oysters of this third stage, which are uphill. Here is a modern stratigraphic log with the modern stages, the stratigraphy, Aquitanian, Bordighalian, and so on. And I report you here Pierre de l'Ancre stages, estages. First estage, second, and so on, up to the top of the cliff. What can we say about the geological ideas of Pierre de l'Ancre? First of all, about the origin of the fossils. He was undecided, but he considers the possibility of the mobility of the seas. And above all, Pierre de l'Ancre used the word stage, estage, well before it came to be used by Alcide d'Orbigny to designate chronostratigraphic division. And de l'Ancre enumerates these stages from bottom to top, whereas Louis XIII and his entourage walk through them from top to bottom, which suggests that he grasped actually the. It's normal that I cannot. Je peux pas scroller là, je peux pas aller dans cette fenêtre là. Oui. Ah si, merci. Ah, faut passer dessus. Excuse me. Hein? Okay, so de l'Ancre enumerates these stages from bottom to top as a modern geologist, actually. So I think that he grasps the principle of superposition and the idea, the concept of chronological sequencing of the layers, actually well before Steno, almost 50 years before Steno formally stated it in his Prodromus. Unfortunately, all these concepts are not very clear in the text by Pierre de l'Ancre, who didn't develop these basic concepts of modern stratigraphy. He was actually more interested in witchcraft and the witches, as I told you. Actually, this is my main conclusions, but I want to take 1 or 2 minutes more to show you what Sainte-Croix-du-Mont after Pierre de l'Ancre. There was an important memoir on this locality in 1618 by l'Abbé Bellet, who presented to the Académie Royale de Bordeaux, and we will speak about the oysters of Sainte-Croix-du-Mont. Father Bellet has no doubt that these oysters are marine oysters, shells, and he cites ancient and modern authors who have reported the presence of such shells on land. He is convinced that the sea was once present in the area and left these shells during its withdrawal. Based on ancient texts, he states that in Roman times, the shore was close to the present one, and that consequently, the sea at Sainte-Croix-du-Mont dates back to the flood, which he believes have occurred 4,115 years ago. You see all these numbers that you can see on his memory here as calculations of the chronology to give this number. After l'Abbé Bellet, the people of the Académie de Bordeaux were very, very interested in this occurrence, and they sent a copy of Bellet's memoir to the regent. We are in 1628, after during the minority of Louis XV, so to the regent Philippe d'Orléans, together with a map that was drawn by Barelier de Bitry, a chief engineer at Bordeaux. This map is still visible at the Bibliothèque de l'Institut in Paris, but unfortunately, the memoir sent to the regent is apparently lost. This is an enlargement of Sainte-Croix-du-Mont that we will visit, with the oyster level here between A and B, the castle and the church. After that, another study was made by the people of the Académie Royale de Bordeaux, and a few, still in the same year, but in August, Isaac Sarraut de Bonnet read another manuscript that you can see here before the Académie. Bonnet noted that the effervescence of the oyster shells in vinegar and the scars left by the adductor muscle of the oysters. So he deduced that the fossils were real marine oysters. However, he hesitated between transport by the flood, deposition by the sea, which was in his mind difficult to imagine given the altitude of the area. And lastly, he suggested that the men of antiquity could have transported these oysters to their present position, which is totally extravagant. Montesquieu, who shared the session of the Academy, was not very pleased with this idea. When one cannot be sure of the truth, he declared it is good to have something that resembles it in order to say we probably can find better. Another important text is the one well-known Teliamed by Benoît de Maillet. You know that this manuscript circulated as an unpublished manuscript in the 1720s, but was not published until the 1748, 10 years after Maillet's death. De Maillet used the Teliamed to present provocative ideas about the history of our planet. And then in this memoir, De Maillet reads, apparently, he knew the memoir of the Academy of Bordeaux about the oysters of Sainte-Croix-du-Mont, and he used them to support his thesis that our planet was once entirely covered with water. Well, during the 18th century, Desalliés d'Argenville, Nicolas Desmarais were also interested in this occurrence, and they had no doubt about the marine origin of this occurrence, of these fossils. And they explained their presence in Aquitaine by incursions of the Atlantic Ocean. However, the systematic study of the shelly sands and sandstones of Aquitaine would begin later in the 1830s with the start of modern geology, and in particular in this region with the detailed work of Jean-Pierre Sylvestre de Gratteloup, and this is a story of modern geology. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gaston. We have time for one or two short questions. I have a question. So, Ezio, please. Can you help me?
Thank you very much, Gaston. D'Ancre seems a very fascinating figure for this period, absolutely unknown, as you said, and part of these sources that we can discover sometime, but we don't expect to find so much information and new ideas. I was just wondering about his relationships with other scholars at that time that could have shared with him this kind of ideas, or if you think he was a complete isolated figure within the scientific milieu, because the fact that he interacted with the court of France, the king, is one aspect. But I was wondering also about possibility to have a relationship with others within France or within Europe.
He didn't have any relationship with no. He was in any case. You need to imagine that he was only interested in witches and this kind of thing. He wrote 4 books about this. I read all these books, and this is only a casual thing because the king went to his home where these oysters are visible. But at the same time, there were other people like Perez, Gaston, the Linchey, and so on, who communicated, but not on this occurrence indeed.
Any other question? Oh, Georgie.
Yeah.
Wow, very interesting. I just wonder where are the closest modern oysters, because in my region, humans really do make big piles of oyster shells, but of course they're no longer articulated. Yeah.
Yes, in France we have those of Saint-Michel-en-Lerme, for example. We were medieval things, but this is a stratigraphic level in the Miocene, you know. So obviously it's a geological, not anthropic. But you are right, that exists.
Modern oyster. Where are the closest modern oysters to that locality?
Sorry,
Sorry. Les huîtres plus près de.
the sea is at about 50 kilometers, something like this. But for the people of the time, for 50 kilometers, to imagine the sea coming from 50 kilometers was almost impossible, except for the L'Ancre. They imagined the flood, which was a real convenient mechanism.
Yes,
Claudine, just Montesquieu seems to have been interested in these oysters.
Oh, he was only the chairman of the session during which they were presented in 17, during the 18th century. I don't remember exactly the date.
So he didn't.
No, nothing more.
But he said there should be some more studies on these at some point, no? There's some.
There should be some.
There should be more studies on these oyster banks.
Yeah, there are at least two memoirs from the probably 3, because one is lost at the Académie des Sciences de Bordeaux, l'Académie royale de Bordeaux.
Oh, thank you very much, Gaston.